AutomationEdge is building delightful workplace experiences. You can quickly map your business or IT processes to AutomationEdge workflows with its innumerable pre-built actions or steps. Hi, I'm Seema from AutomationEdge Professional Services. In this video, I will display the Workflow Executor and the Process Executor steps for calling child workflows or processes respectively. Let us begin. First, let us see a description of a workflow and a process. Workflow. A workflow is a logical grouping of Process Studio steps for data processing in parallel across steps. Process. A process is a grouping of Process Studio actions or entries to create a flow for coordinating resources, execution, and dependencies. A process performs serialized activities by default, or you can configure actions for parallel activities. Let us describe the Workflow Executor step. The Workflow Executor is a step in the flow category for Process Studio workflows. The Workflow Executor step executes a previously defined workflow from within a workflow. It acts as a container for child workflows in a workflow. It provides modularity by grouping logical tasks in separate workflows. It helps you configure a parent-child hierarchy of workflows. The Workflow Executor step executes the workflow once for each input row in the stream. You can set incoming row fields as parameters and variables in the Workflow Executor step to pass to the child workflow for further processing. The Workflow Executor step functions in the following ways. By default, the number of rows to send to the child workflow is one at a time. You can also pass a group of rows by incrementing the number of rows to send to the workflow based on a field value to group by, or based on time to wait to collect rows. The first row of the group of rows is the result row used to set parameters or variables to pass to the child workflow for further processing. Now let us have a look at the Workflow Executor configuration options in Process Studio. I'm in Process Studio. I have created a blank workflow as the parent workflow and a blank child workflow. In the parent workflow, from the flow category, let me drag and drop the Workflow Executor step. Let us double click to open the configuration options. Now before I walk you through each of the configuration options, let me give some context to the Workflow Executor step. Let me create some incoming fields and target steps from the Workflow Executor step. So let me cancel for now. In the parent workflow, I have added a CSV input step. Let us preview the data in the CSV step. It has sales information, that is customer name, product, quantity purchased, and unit price. So let us close this. I have connected the CSV file input to the Workflow Executor step. I have also added a dummy step as a target step. Now let us try to connect. As you can see, there are 6 options for output hops from the Workflow Executor step. So to cater to all the results, let us create 6 target steps as targets for the execution result, for the result rows after execution, for the result file name after execution, for the executor steps input data only, the main output of the step, and the error handling step. So I have added 5 dummy steps and a text file output step as the target steps of the Workflow Executor. Let me rename the steps. The first step is for the execution results hop. The second step is for the result rows. It is a text file output, and I wish to store the file in the current workflow directory. The third step is for the result file names. So let me rename it result file names. The fourth target step is for executor steps input data. Let me connect it. Let me rename it input data. The fifth target step is the main output of the step. Let me rename it main output. And finally, the last is the error handling of step. Let us connect the other hops as well. The first one is the output will contain the execution results. The second one is a text file output for the result rows after execution. The third one is the result file names after execution, and let us rename the error handling step to error handling. For error handling, we also need to configure error handling in the workflow executor step. So right click and select error handling. The target step is error handling, and we wish to enable error handling. You can specify field names. The first one is for number of errors. The second one, error description. The third one, error fields, error codes, and there are other options to capture. For now, I will leave them blank. Click OK. Now let us configure the workflow executor step. Double click. The first is the workflow file name. So you can click to browse for the child workflow. I will select the child workflow that I defined. You can also select the child workflow from the repository. However, this option is unavailable right now, and the repository by reference option is also unavailable. Then we have the buttons New Workflow and Edit Workflow. You can click on New Workflow to create a new child workflow, or you can click on Edit Workflow to open the current workflow selected in the file name. Now let us go to the tabs below. The first is the parameter names. In the variable parameter name column, you can define variables to pass to the child workflow, and in the field to use, you can specify which field to use to set the value of the variable or parameter. If you specify an input field to use, then the static input value is not used. Instead of field to use, you can also specify a static input value for the variable or parameter. Alternatively, you can first define variables or parameters in the child workflow and then use the get parameters to fetch the parameter names. Let me use this approach. So for now, let me click OK. Let me go to the child workflow. In the child workflow, I have added a calculator step to calculate the total sales revenue as a product of the quantity and unit price. So I need to pass the values from the parent to the child as parameters. So let me define the parameters. Double click on the canvas to define the parameters. On the parameters tab, I wish to define a parameter for the customer name, a parameter for the product, a parameter for the quantity, and a parameter for the unit price. Let me provide a description: customer, product, quantity, and unit price. In the type, customer is a string, product is a string, quantity is an integer, and unit price is an integer. So I've defined the parameters of the child workflow. Now let us go back to the parent workflow. Click on the workflow executor step. Click the get parameters button to fetch the parameters from the child workflow. So as you can see, the 4 parameters. Now for customer, I wish to provide a value from the customer field. So static input value will not be used. I can even delete these. For the product, let me choose product field from the CSV input file, quantity from the input file, and the unit price. Now let us go ahead and complete the configurations of the workflow executor step, and then we will proceed with the child workflow. So the next option is inherit all variables from the workflow. You can select the checkbox to pass all workflow parameters to the specified child workflow. It is selected by default. And then we have the common option for all the tabs: on error, execute only error path. As we saw that the workflow executor step has several target steps, and it executes all the target steps, and it follows the hops for all the target steps. In case of error also, it follows all the target hops. However, you can check on error, execute only error path to skip the other hops in case of error. So let us check it. Let us go to the next tab, row grouping. In this tab, you can specify the number of input rows to pass to the workflow as result rows. The first option is number of rows to send to workflow. The default is 1. It sends 1 row at a time to the child workflow. However, you can increment the value to any number. For example, if you specify 5, then after every 5 rows, then the workflow will be executed after every 5 rows, and these 5 rows will be passed at a time to the workflow. However, it uses only the first row to set the parameter values. Now if you leave it blank, the other options are enabled. In the field to group rows on, you can select a grouping field, for example say customer. So rows will be accumulated in a group as long as the field value stays the same. If the value changes, then the workflow is executed and the accumulated rows are passed to the workflow. However, the first row, that is the result row, is used to set the value of the variables or parameters to pass to the child workflow. Let us leave it blank. And the third and final option is the time to wait to collect rows before execution. So specify the maximum time in milliseconds to accumulate rows prior to executing the workflow. I will demonstrate all the options. For now, let me start with the default option, that is, I will pass one row to the child workflow. The next is the execution results tab. Now since we have already connected the target hops, it has selected the execution results target step as the target step for the execution results. You can configure the other fields such as the field name of the execution time. So provide a field name to store the execution time in milliseconds, or provide the field name to store the execution result, or field name to store the number of errors, and so on. So it captures all the execution results. So in this tab you can configure field names to capture all the execution results. The next is the result rows. Since we have already connected the hop, it has selected the result rows as the target step of the output hop. The expected layout of the result rows. Now in the field name you can specify the field names coming from the child workflow that are a part of the result. Make sure the field name is exactly same as that in the child workflow. You can correspondingly specify the data type from the drop-down list, the length and precision. However, you can leave this table blank if you wish to see all the fields of the child workflow in the output result rows. For now, for this demo, I will leave it blank. Let us go to the result files. You can select the step to send the result files. Since we have already drawn the hop, it has already selected the target step, and specify a field name to store the result file name. And finally, the logging settings. It is optional. You can enable checkbox if you wish to specify a log file. You can keep appending to the same file. You can provide a path for your file. I will store a file in the current workflow directory, and you can specify an extension for the file. You can select a log level. The log levels are same like those in Process Studio. I will leave it to basic, that is the default. Let me change the log file name to log. So we have seen the configurations of the Workflow Executor. For now, let us click OK. Save your workflow. Let us go to the child workflow. Now in the child workflow, we already defined the parameters that we wish to read. Now to get the parameters as fields in the stream, let me drag and drop a get variable step and connect it to the calculator step. Let us configure the get variable step. Click on the get variables button. It gets all the variables. Let me drop the extra variables, and I wish to retain the customer, product, quantity and unit price. I have changed the order of the variables to customer, product, quantity and unit price. Let me change the data type for quantity to integer and the unit price to integer. In the format, let me select the hash for a whole number. Let us click OK. Now we have the variables passed from the parent to the child. In the calculator step, I wish to create a new field for sales revenue, and I wish to calculate a product of two numbers, that is quantity and unit price. Let me click OK. Now I want to copy the results from the child workflow, that is all the 5 fields including customer, product, quantity, unit price and sales revenue, to the parent workflow. There is a step available in Process Studio, copy rows to result. So let us drag and drop the copy rows to result. Let us double click. It just has the step name for configuration and there are no other configurations. it copies all the rows to the result. So all the rows will be available in the result and we will be able to see the results in the target steps. Now let me go back to the child workflow. For my first case, I'm passing one row at a time. To be able to view that, let me add an alert. Let me add the modified JavaScript step to the workflow. And I wish to create an alert to see the customer name and an alert to see the product. So let me click OK. Now let me go back to the parent. We are ready to execute the workflow. Let us click Run. So you can see the first customer and the corresponding product, the second customer and the product, the third row, the fourth customer and product, the fifth row, sixth row being passed to the child workflow, seventh row being passed, eighth row, ninth row, and the 10th row. So it passed the row one at a time as expected. Now let us check the target steps. Let us preview the data. Let me first go to the CSV input step. As you can see, it has 10 input rows. And let us see the target step. The first is the execution result, which gives you execution time, execution result, number of errors, and all the configured fields. Let us go to result rows. It is a text file output. So let me check in the resources. Let me open the file. You can see the customer, product, quantity, unit price, and sales revenue information in the file. Let us close the file. Let me go to the result file names. So there were no file names, so the file name field is blank. In the input data, you can see all the input rows, main output, and in the error handling, you can see the error fields. However, there were no errors during execution. We can also check the log file. It has stored the logs of the workflow execution at the basic level. Let us go back to the workflow executor. In the row grouping, let us remove the first option, and in the filter to group rows, let us specify customer. So it will group by customer, and if there are any consecutive input rows with the same customer name, it picks only the first one to pass as the result row to the child workflow. So let us click OK. Let us execute the workflow. It shows the first customer, it shows the second customer, the third customer, and then the AutomationEdge customer appears again, and the last customer appears again. Let us check the CSV file. So it has picked up one row of Thunderbolts from the 4 consecutive Thunderbolt, one row of AutomationEdge, one row of Google, one row of AutomationEdge again, as there are 2 consecutive values, and then one row of Google again. Similarly, you can explore the third row grouping tab option, that is time to wait collecting rows before execution. Next, we will look at the process executor step. Now let us describe the process executor step. It behaves similar to the workflow executor step. The process executor is a step in the flow category for Process Studio workflows. The Process Studio step executes a previously defined process from within a workflow. It acts as a container for child processes in the parent workflow. It provides modularity by creating different flows in separate processes. It helps create a parent-child hierarchy of processes in a workflow. The process executor step executes the process once for each input row in the stream. You can set the row fields as parameters and variables to pass to the process for further processing. The process executor step functions in the following ways. By default, the number of rows to send to the process is 1 at a time. You can also pass a group of rows by incrementing the number of rows to send to the process based on a field value to group by, or based on time to collect rows. The first row of the group of rows is the result row to set parameters or variables to pass to the process for further processing. Now let us have a look at the process executor step configuration options in Process Studio. I'm in Process Studio. I have created a parent workflow with a process executor step and a child process. The configurations of the process executor step are similar to the workflow executor step, hence I will not explain each of the options. I will just show the configurations of the Process Executor step in the context of a workflow. So let us begin. I'm in the parent workflow. I have defined a parameter, new message. Then we have a get variable step, and I create a new field, new message. I pass the field to the Process Executor step, and I want the Process Executor step to pass it to the child process for further processing. Now before I come to Process Executor, let us go to the child process. In the child process, I have a display message box to display the message passed from the parent to the child process. So to pass the parameter from the parent to the child, let me define a parameter in the child process. I have called this parameter message of the type string. Click OK. Let us go back to the parent workflow. In the parent, let us look at the Process Executor configurations. First of all, in the process, I have selected the child process, and in the parameters, I use the get parameters to fetch the parameter from the child process, and I'm passing the value from the new message field. The other configurations for row grouping, execution results, result rows, result files, and logging settings are exactly similar to the Workflow Executor step, so I will not explain them in detail. Let us click OK. Now from the Process Executor step, there are 5 possible output hops. So it has one less hop compared to the Workflow Executor. It doesn't have the hop to show all the input rows. Let me just delete one of the hops so that I can show the hop options. It has the options to capture the execution results, the result rows after execution, the result file names, the main output, and the error handling of the step. So the first one is for execution results. I'm in the parent workflow. Let us execute the workflow so that we can see if the parameter is passed from the parent to the child workflow. Before I execute, let me show you the parameter value. So the parameter new message default value is Process Executor demo, and we will alert the new message. And in the child workflow, we have a display message box that will display a thank you and the message. So let us execute the workflow. It displays the first alert containing the default value Process Executor demo, and it displays the second message box containing thank you and the value of the message. I gave you a walkthrough of the Process Executor step configurations. Let us recap. We saw the Workflow Executor and Process Executor steps, description, and configuration options. You can jumpstart your digital transformation journey with AutomationEdge's conversational AI and hyperautomation platforms.